And it's our privilege to bring Ken up this morning and let him share God's word with us. So let's give it up for Ken Needham, all right? And he changed. You were wearing a suit jacket the first service and and shoes. What happened to you? You converted to Hawaii.
It got warmer.
Oh, okay, warmer.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rick, I think. It's good to be here. And some of you I know have a habit, it's quite a good habit. You read a bit of the Bible every day. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but it is quite a good habit. However, if you were to invest in a John Grisham novel, maybe 365 pages, if you were going to read half a page every day, it would take you 2 years to get through it, and it wouldn't be very exciting, would it? One of the problems with just reading a bit at a time is you miss the flow and the drama and the tension. And sometimes it's good just to sit down and read one book out of the Bible, just straight through. It doesn't take very long. And one of the best books you could do that with is the Gospel of Luke, and we're going to be looking at a bit of that this morning. And Luke is a bit like an old movie that was called High Noon. It was about a goodie and a baddie, of course. It was a Western, and there was a build-up to the time when these two would meet, and one of them would survive and the other one wouldn't. And Luke's Gospel is a bit like that. And there's a build-up to the two contestants who are going to meet each other. One of them is the city of Jerusalem, and the other one is the man from nowhere. City of Jerusalem, the religious capital of the world. Been the capital of Judah since King David's time. It's about 1,000 years. Temple about 30 years old, built by Herod, would accommodate more than 40,000 people standing. King David, amongst other things, in his spare time, designed and produced 4,000 musical instruments and wrote songs and things too. And those were all put in the temple. And no doubt the originals had been worn out, but no doubt they've been replaced. And you've got a substantial worship team. Along with that, that's just the backing group. You've got a choir that's bigger than the instrumentalist. And then you've got priests in fancy robes, and you've got altars and sacrifices and all kinds of stuff. And religion was thriving. However, the temple was not the dominant building in Jerusalem, because the Jews had been conquered by a heathen power, the Romans, who were very strong in the military sense and very severe, very harsh sometimes. And most nations conquered by the Romans were happy afterwards, because they became part of a much bigger empire, and one where roads were put in, really good roads, and harbors, and the opportunity of trade with other countries, and prosperity, and real stability, rule of law. Most nations were happy to be part of the Roman Empire. The Jews never were, because to the Jews, the Romans were disgusting, yucky heathen people. Ugh. And who wants to be ruled by the heathen? No. And so the Jews were always looking for an opportunity to kill a few Romans and kick them out and assert their independence. And so, and like all the other places they conquered, the Romans had to keep lots of soldiers in Jerusalem. So actually the dominant building in Jerusalem at the time was not the temple, it was the Roman garrison. And all these soldiers had to be paid for and the Romans were not about to pay for it. They taxed the Jews, and they had to pay for it. And it was hated and really bitterly resented. And Jerusalem was a little bit of a powder keg because it could explode any time. The Romans were on the lookout for any kind of public disturbance. The Jewish leaders were careful to try to keep their people controlled. So that was Jerusalem. Then there's the man from nowhere. It may sound a bit irreverent, but that's what he was. I mean, we know he's the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We've just been singing about that. And we don't want to take away from that, but we're talking about Jesus the man. And Jesus the man lived in a little dump of a place called Nazareth, a place that comedians made jokes about. And as a small boy, he was a refugee in a foreign country. His dad was a manual worker, and he died young. It seems Jesus was left as the breadwinner for the family. Mother, 4 brothers who are named for us in Mark's Gospel, that's 5 boys. At least an equal number of girls. And Jesus had to work 6 days a week manually to support this family. Didn't have much time for study, didn't own any books, didn't own his own copy of the Bible, didn't have much of an education. What he did have was just in the synagogue school taught by some boring old rabbi who had memorized Leviticus but forgotten who God is. And there weren't even any girls in the school to make it interesting. So, but he's been in public life for 3 years, traveling around, mostly not in very important places, but a bit of a reputation building up. Some miracles have happened, and he has a fan club, mostly rabble, but they're enthusiastic. And Jesus is coming to Jerusalem. And can we pick that up now in Luke 19? So after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. There you get the build-up. This is about the 6th time Luke has said this in his gospel. And so this big encounter is about to happen. Going up to Jerusalem, as he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden." And he's going to ride this thing? I remember the first time I rode a horse. I remember it well because it's also the last time I rode one. And it was really old and docile and well-disciplined, and it was more likely to collapse under me than it was to run away with me, but I was terrified. Jesus never owned a horse. He'd never ridden one before, and he's going to ride an unbroken one into a city he doesn't know with all kinds of people yelling and screaming. And all these people are around there, and they spread their clothes on the road and cut branches off the trees, lay them in the ground for him to ride over them. Go to the village ahead of you. As you enter it, you'll find a colt tied there on which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, "Why are you untying it?" say, "The Lord needs it." Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked, "Why are you untying the colt?" They replied, "The Lord needs it." They brought it to Jesus, and we'll go on from there. So Jesus rides into Jerusalem, and there's, a couple of hundred people supporting and shouting, and this is a big potential disturbance, and the authorities don't like it, and they don't like some of the things that the people are shouting because it sounds like blasphemy to them. And so the Jewish leaders come and say to him, "Master, tell your fan club to shut up, would you? And Jesus says, well, even if they do, the stones will cry out. And I have an Irish friend who says, no old stone is going to take away my right to praise. And there are two questions we need to think about as this encounter takes place. What is Jerusalem going to think of Jesus? I mean, that's where it all's been happening for centuries. What is this notable city going to think of Jesus? What is the religious capital of the world going to think of Jesus? And the other question, what is Jesus going to think of Jerusalem? Does it matter? Well, it does actually. And we're not left to guess, because we're told as he approached the city and looked at it, he wept. Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem. And, I'm in a new place pretty well every week. And I often find myself asking the question, what does Jesus think about this place? I've been lots of places where they have a pretty high opinion of themselves. What does Jesus think? And sometimes Jesus' idea is very different from the people's opinion of themselves. And I need to keep asking myself, what does Jesus think of me today? I know he loves me, but that's not really the question. How about the performance? And why did he weep over them? He saw them as sheep having no shepherd. And a sheep with no shepherd is in serious trouble. It can't fight back if it's left to face a lion. It can't run fast enough to get away from a wolf. And it probably doesn't know where the next field is that's got some food in it. A sheep with no shepherd is seriously at risk. And that's how Jesus saw Jerusalem. Because Jesus is, of course, the heart of God. And he has come to seek and to save the lost. And sometimes when we use the word lost, we think dumb. Dumb people get lost, right? I do. And that's usually the reason, even if I do have an English accent. But that's not what Jesus means. See, the word lost also implies value. You don't lose trash. You throw it away and you don't know where it is, but it's not lost because you're not looking for it. Something is only lost if it's valuable, and that's a kind word that Jesus uses about you and me. He has come to seek and save the lost. And if that's his heart, then he's weeping over Jerusalem, because in spite of all the thriving religion, the people are lost. He goes into the temple, the world center of religion. Lots of people there, lots of money about, tables full of money. And this is the place where the God who seeks the lost ought to be able to meet the lost, and the lost ought to be able to approach God. The only problem is the message has gone out. You can't come in here without a sacrifice. And you cannot bring your own dirty animal to sacrifice in our temple. Oh dear, no. You have to buy a sacrifice here. Probably exactly the same animal you've got at home, maybe a little bit cleaner, but 10 times the price. And you can't bring your own dirty money in here and buy a sacrifice. No. You have to exchange it for nice temple money at 10 times the price. So you're ripped off 10 times to get the money and 10 times again to buy the sacrifice. And it costs 100 times what it would cost you to bring your own animal. And most people just plain could not afford it. and they felt unworthy and they felt excluded and that God didn't care about them and there was no way for them to approach God. And that's what got Jesus mad. And I love this picture because as a small boy I was fed a picture of Jesus who was so weak and effeminate I didn't want anything to do with him. I like this picture of Jesus getting mad. And he walked up to a table covered in coins and flung it over. And there are coins rolling all over the floor, and they're making a metallic chink as they fall onto the stone floor. And the fat little Jewish businessmen are scrabbling around on their knees, trying to recover them all before somebody else does. And he goes down the whole line of tables, throws them all over, and then he makes a whip out of ropes and drives the money changers out of the temple. And you might expect that that will be somewhat unpopular amongst the people who are running this show, because they've got such a nice deal going. You know, they wear fantastic robes, they're admired and respected as holy people, and they're making a financial killing. And Jesus is messing up the whole show. See, men are always trying to hijack religion. They probably talked about it as our temple. I've met people who talk about our church. I've had pastors speaking of my church. Sorry, mate, it's not yours. You didn't die for it. So it's not long before there's a confrontation. It's the really powerful people facing the man from nowhere with no education. And they take a line from one of today's popular television shows. Who do you think you are? Coming in here, overturning everything. This has been established for decades. Put yourself in Jesus' place. These men have got real power, you know? And they look so impressive, you know, and it's their territory, it's not yours. You've just come from Nazareth. What would you say? You know, oh, I'm sorry. I just got carried away. Sorry, won't do it again, I promise. However, Jesus doesn't react that way. Instead, he responds in classic rabbinical fashion, answering a question by asking another one. It's always a good technique if you don't know the answer. Today's politicians use it all the time. I will ask you a question. John the Baptist, where did he get his authority? They go into a little huddle to discuss how to answer this question. That's surprising to begin with, isn't it? And who was John the Baptist anyway? Well, technically he was a priest, because his dad was a priest and the priesthood was inherited. However, John the Baptist did not function as a priest, didn't wear the robes, didn't work in the temple. He worked in the most unlikely place, out in the desert. And he was kind of uncouth. He wore the most ordinary clothes and had the simplest of diets. There was no money involved, no hype. But people went in their thousands to listen to him. And when they got there, he was rude. You know? He said, "You guys need to be baptized." What? Baptism was not for Jews. Baptism was for the yucky heathen if they wanted to become Jews. They'd been born Jews. But John the Baptist was saying, you're not really Jews. You need to start all over again, get baptized. And they did. Why didn't they stay in Jerusalem, go into a nice, cool marble building with all the facilities, and all the instruments. And why go out in the desert? There's not even any music. And it's hot and there's no shade. And this uncouth guy is yelling at people and dunking them in the river, and there are no changing facilities. Because they knew John was authentic. There was about John the genuine authority of God. He was a true prophet, and there hadn't been one for 4 centuries. And in case you didn't know it, 4 centuries is a long time in American history. Sorry, I had to get that in. And so they go into a little huddle. What should we say? Now, if we say John had authority from God, he's going to say, then how is it that you people who are supposed to be leaders and examples didn't go and get baptized? If he was from God, you should have, shouldn't you? If, on the other hand, we say John had no authority, he was just some guy out in the desert, then the ordinary people are going to string us up from the nearest tree because they like John. So they say, we cannot tell. And Jesus penetrates the hypocrisy by saying, neither will I answer your question. It's not you can't, you won't. And if you won't answer my question, I don't have to answer yours, do I? See ya. That's the end of that confrontation. But there's another one coming up that's been thought out much more cleverly, much more subtly, and the leaders don't show up themselves because that would put Jesus on his guard. No, they send some of their students, and they approach him, and they're kind of humble, and they call him rabbi to boost his confidence. And they say, hey, it really isn't right, is it, that we should give our beautiful, hard-earned, holy Jewish money to these heathen Romans? We shouldn't have to do that, should we? And this is a clever question because paying taxes was extremely unpopular. You know, it's not even the favorite thing that most Americans do that I know. But see, these taxes were paid to the enemy, and they were taken from the holy people to the heathen. And they were heavy taxes because there was a big garrison. And it was deeply resented. And so if Jesus says yes, then he's going to be unpopular. And he's alienating the very people that he's trying to embrace and reach. If, on the other hand, they said, no, let's stop doing it, then they just denounce him to the Romans and he'll be dead before nightfall. See, it's one of these questions, if you say yes or no, you're lost. You know, either you're thrown out or you're executed. So it's a clever question presented in a clever fashion. And even when you know what it's all about, it's kind of awkward, isn't it? How do you get out of it? And Jesus says, show me a coin. And it's interesting that he didn't fish in his pocket and pull one out, probably because he didn't have a pocket. But a coin is produced and he holds it up. Whose image is that? Caesar's. Then it must belong to him, right? So you should give back to him what belongs to him. No, you shouldn't give him what is yours, but you nice, holy, obedient people of God, you don't want to steal from the heathen, do you? So give back to them what belongs to them. You don't need it, do you? And while you're giving back to Caesar what belongs to him, give back to God what belongs to him. What's that all about? Well, in the order in which our Old Testament is arranged, the last book is called Malachi, in which God asks a question. Will a man rob God? And you say, how have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings. You know very well you've not been giving what you're supposed to. But let's take this a little further, because you're not Old Testament people, are you? One or two of you look as though you might be, but no. You must be from Winnipeg or somewhere. Imagine your church back home, where you have a new youth pastor. And he's having difficulty being accepted by the rebellious high school kids. It's not this church, of course, it's some other church. And he feels he's got to do something to impress these kids. And what he needs is a status symbol. I could just once say a status symbol, just so you know what I'm talking about. He needs a status symbol. And having thought that through, he thinks wheels. And then he thinks Ferrari. And then he thinks yellow. And then he phones the Ferrari dealership and finds you can get one for $100,000. Not top of the range, but that, an ordinary one will do. So he checks with his bank to see if he's got 100,000 just waiting to be spent, and it's not there. So he saves his astronomical youth pastor's salary for a month, and then he orders one, and it's delivered to his home, because you don't have to go and get a Ferrari, they'll bring it to you. And it's delivered to his home Saturday evening. And he's just burning with desire to take it out and see if it will really do 220 miles an hour, as it's reputed to. But that wouldn't be spiritual. And he is a youth pastor. So he should save it for going to church tomorrow morning. So difficult as it is, he just leaves it there outside the house overnight, Saturday, thinking, I can drive up, pop a few wheelies in the parking lot. The kids will all come out and they'll say, oh, that's who you are. We didn't realize. Of course, there's no use coming before everybody else, so he needs to leave it a little bit late. And he does. But when he goes out the house to get in the car, it's not there. His wife has come to church in it. Women have rights in America. And he's patient and spiritual and gets on his bicycle, paddles over here, just a little bit late, and of course he forgives her. Just locks her in the office to make sure she doesn't do it again, and thinks this could be in my favor because now I can leave in the Ferrari. Everyone will see me leaving. I will still get the kudos, and I won't be here to answer all the embarrassing questions like what happened to the church building fund and all that sort of thing. After the service, he steps out into the parking lot in time to see the senior pastor driving away. Who is the senior pastor after all? And Sunday evening, the local sheriff is testing it because it would be a good vehicle to catch some of the bad guys. And 2 years go by and he's still not even sat in the driving seat of his $100,000 purchase. And although he's very patient and spiritual, it's just beginning to get under his skin and irritate him a bit. And he sits down one day and thinks, did I not spend $100,000 on that? So why don't I get to drive it? Why are all these other people driving around it and not me? And you're probably thinking this is an awfully stupid story. And you are absolutely right. It is. Except, didn't somebody pay more than that for you? Didn't Jesus pay more than that for you? I mean, way more than a mere 100,000, didn't he? So if he paid for you, who do you belong to? Paul had to write to the Corinthians and say, hey, don't you know you've been bought with a price and you're not your own? It's called redemption. Is it possible that Jesus has been wanting to use you for some of his own purposes and he hasn't been able to do it because you've not been available? Your days filled up with stuff for yourself or somebody else or any old dumb thing except being there you want for the one you belong to. Will a man rob God? Give back to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Give back to God what belongs to God. See you. That was the end of that conversation. Well, there's one other group of people, they've been watching this and they've been delighted because they really don't like the religious leaders. They're fanatics, these religious leaders. They take it all way too seriously. And they're kind of killjoys. And these guys are Sadducees. And they're not all that sad, you see, because actually they have a good life, they think. They're wealthy, they're educated, they're cultured, and they're not anti-religious. They are Jews. But they're not fanatics. You know, they don't believe in judgment and life after death and miracles and all that stuff. No, far too sophisticated. But, I mean, they'll show up once in a while if the occasion's good enough. Christmas, Easter, they'll be there, you know. If it's good to be seen there, they'll be there. And they've been watching Jesus encounter their hated Pharisee opponents, and they've been thinking, hey, this guy's great. And now they come up to him with their question, which the Pharisees could never answer. And it has to do with the resurrection, which they didn't believe in. And they say to him, Rabbi, of course, they give him the title again. Rabbi, there was this nice Jewish woman, and as good Jewish ladies do, she got married. And it was great until her husband died. It was a bit sad, but Jewish law caters for this because it says she shouldn't be left alone, but the next brother in the family ought to take over. So brother number 2 married her. Unfortunately, he also died, and this is really a pretty sad story because there are 7 boys in this family, and they all marry, and then they all die. And then she dies. Now, Master, the question is, in this supposed resurrection, whose wife will she be? And you can imagine the debates. The oldest brother would say, she's mine, I married her first. The youngest would say, no, she's mine, I married her last. And number 5 might say, well, if you want to go ahead, she was kind of dangerous, wasn't she? And think of the embarrassment for the poor woman herself. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, yeah, which? So obviously there is no resurrection, is there? And Jesus confronts them and he says, you're in error. For 2 reasons. 1, you don't know the power of God, and 2, you don't know the scripture. That's telling him. You don't know the power of God because in heaven, we're going to be like the angels. The angels don't get married. They don't miss it. They don't even think about it because they have no sexuality and they're perfectly content without it. And we're all going to be like that in heaven. So your question is totally relevant. Second, have you never read, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Well, of course they had. It was a very common verse, repeated numerous times in the Old Testament. And of course they'd read it. So what's the point of it if they all know it? I am the God of Abraham. Abraham died 2,000 years ago. But he doesn't say, I was the God of Abraham. I am the God of Abraham, because there is a resurrection, and Abraham's still around. I am the God of Abraham. I am the God of Isaac. I am the God of Jacob. You're in error because you don't know the scripture. And it was so simple and so obvious, but nobody had ever seen it until Jesus. And that was the end of that. See it? The end of the Sadducees. The next line is really interesting. Here's a nowhere man in Jerusalem. You know what it says? Nobody else dared ask him another question. It's not bad for a nowhere man, is it? And for the past 2,000 years, well-versed scholars, hostile scholars, have examined the sayings and teachings of Jesus, wanting to demolish it, and nobody has found any flaw in anything Jesus ever said or taught. How does he do it? See, it's not, if you think, well, of course he's God. No. No. Jesus was never less than God, but somehow or other, he lived as no more than man. How did he know what to say? How did he answer all these people? How did he steer through all the snares and pitfalls? How did he anticipate the next 2,000 years of critical examination? He didn't. But here's his simple explanation. Truly, truly, I tell you, the words I say are not my words. The Father who lives in me does everything. Jesus didn't have a corporation, didn't have a bank, didn't have transport, didn't write a book, didn't have a secretary, didn't have a PR person. But he had the Father. The totally adequate resource for every situation he would ever be in. And Jesus was so abandoned to the Father always filled him and moved him to wherever he wanted him to be. And wherever he was, Jesus always let the Father out through every word he said and everything he ever did. When you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Why am I telling you this? Because Jesus is sending you on the same terms. As the Father sent me, so I send you. Every believer is a missionary. You're bought by Jesus to be a missionary for Jesus. In fact, in a song we sang earlier, fill me with your heart, so your love can touch all those around me. That's the whole story of being a Christian. A missionary sent by the Father. Sometimes we think of missionaries as super saints wearing funny clothes sent to other places to speak a funny language. No. Every Christian is a missionary. You've got a mission. And it's a really important one. And real fulfillment is completing your mission. You'll find nothing else more fulfilling or more exciting. So let me encourage you to get on with it, and I'm stopping.
Thanks, Ken. If you like that kind of stuff, One Day Bible School, make sure to sign up for it. Let's have a word of prayer, all right? Father, just thank you just for the encouraging words, for the examples, for the illumination from the book of Luke. Just thank you for Ken and for his mentoring services all around the world. Just ask that we might be reflections of you. Our words might be your words. Our actions might be your actions as you live and work through us. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Hey, God bless you. Thank you for joining us here at Quiet Christian Fellowship. Grab a pie on your way out and hang out and talk story with people.